Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be talking about my top 10 players of all time for Survivor US. Now, it's been a long time coming. I've obviously done top 10 lists already for BBCAN, BBUS, Australian Survivor, Survivor South Africa, but here we are with Survivor US, and this was tough. I really did not expect this to be as difficult as it was. It was so difficult to the point where I am going to go through a whole bunch of honorable mentions. I actually have 24 honorable mentions to talk about. Narrowing it down to 10 was brutal. I even at one point considered making it into a top 20 list, maybe top 25. But I decided, you know what, no, let's keep it at top 10. I'll just have a very long honorable mention section here. So let's get off of the honorable mentions. Now, essentially, I'll be going through these people in the order of when they first played. So let's start off with Richard Hatch. Richard Hatch, obviously the first winner of Survivor. I just feel like he has so many holes even in his initial game. And I feel like he's someone that's not very adaptable in terms of how he would play on multiple seasons. So he didn't make the cut for me. I consider Tina, as I think for the time, Tina played an extremely impressive game back in the Australian Outback. But I think as shown in Blood vs. Water, I don't feel like her game really adapts super well to the modern game. I do think she still takes things a bit too personally, and I don't feel like she has the strategic mind to keep up with the modern game of Survivor, so I left her off. I consider Brian Heidik, obviously one of the more dominant winners in the history of Survivor, but also another one that had so many holes in his game, to the point where he almost loses against the GOAT in Clay. And also, again, I just don't see how he can get away with doing what he normally does on any season. I think he needs a specific type of cast to do that, so I left Brian Heidik off. I considered Rob Cesternino. I think Rob Cesternino obviously is one of the better minds for the game of Survivor. However, I think he's another one that is a very high variance player. I think his style of game only works with certain casts, and given his all-star showing, I didn't feel comfortable putting him that high on the list. This is going to be a controversial one, but I did not put Sandra on my list. And to be honest, Sandra wasn't really that close to make it on my list either. I mean, obviously, she is the two-time winner of Survivor, but I never really found either of her games too impressive. I feel like Winners at War just fully cemented my opinion on her as really just not that great of a strategic player. Mixing that in with the fact that, again, I feel like in Pearl Island, she gets extremely lucky that they don't go to tribal earlier on, because I do think she's the first boot from her tribe if they do. In Heroes vs. Villain, she's extremely lucky the entire way through, where she actively tries to get Russell taken out, but because she actively fails at everything she's trying to do, she ends up winning in a jury vote against him at the end. And then in Game Changers, is able to make it pretty far and really only gets taken out due to being swap screwed. But I think there are signs of some pretty bad strategic gameplay throughout that season as well. And I think in Winners of War, she really cements that with, again, her not being able to work with people after they've turned against her. And obviously her Denise move, where she gives Denise the idol, is just a completely dumb move. One of the worst moves done by a winner of Survivor, in my opinion. So for me, again, like, Sandra didn't really even come close to making my list when I put this together, though I do think if this was pre-Winners at War, she definitely would have been closer to making the list. I consider Johnny Fairplay. I mean, Johnny Fairplay didn't really make it that close, though. I mean, he's kind of in a similar situation to Rob, where I feel like he's a high variance player. Though I do think they play very similarly, it's just I feel like Johnny Fairplay also enacts a more negative reaction to people than Rob Cesternino does. I considered Chris Doherty. Chris Doherty was someone I really would have liked to put on the list, and he wasn't that far off. Like, while I do have problems with his winning game, I do think he is someone that showed the ability to adapt to many different scenarios, but for me, again, just didn't make the cut. Another person that was so close to making the list was Tom Westman. I mean, out of this entire top 10, like, Tom Westman was number 11 or 12. Like, he was right there. Again, obviously a dominant force on his original season, was able to win a whole bunch of challenges, had a great strategic mind for the game, was decent enough socially. I think one of the problems for me of Tom Westman, though, is I feel like on any season that he makes it to the end, he's going to need to win out. I feel like there's no way Tom Westman is ever allowed to get anywhere close to the end of the game on his own right. I think he always needs to win the challenges to get there. And, like, if we're talking about current Tom Westman, I don't think current Tom Westman is someone that's able to do that. So I think a lot of his game ability revolves around when he plays. Like, obviously when he won his original season, I think that was a point where Tom Westman could do that. But I think, like, current Tom Westman can't do that. So I just felt like there was so much variance with his game that I just didn't feel comfortable putting him in the top 10. I also considered Yul. Yul was someone that was very close to making the list, and he was another one that was pretty close. He was like probably number 13, I would think. Again, just simply didn't make the cut. I consider Todd. I think Todd's a great player. The problem with Todd is I just don't feel like we have enough information. Like, we don't know how he plays from the bottom. Like, he was always on the top on his season. So because I just didn't feel comfortable putting him on, I considered Amanda, someone that's obviously played 3 times and made it to the end twice. That is impressive, but at the same time, it's like kind of like Sandra. I mean, that doesn't necessarily make you that great of a player. And well, to be honest, I think her roads to the end on both first seasons are more impressive than Sandra's. I do feel like overall as a player, she is missing a little something that pushes her above some of these other players, and really she wasn't that close to making my top 10. I consider JT, and JT is someone that I think if you asked me immediately after Tocantins, I mean, he would be very high on this list. But after his future appearances, while those don't credit his win in Tocantins, I think no matter what, he is a top tier winner of Survivor. I think as a player as a whole, I do think they knock him down a bit. I do think he gets a bit too overconfident. Obviously gets taken out in Heroes vs. Villains for giving his idol to Russell, which I think inherently isn't a bad move. I do think there is some merit to it. It's just it doesn't work out for him. And I think the Game Changers run is even worse, where obviously he had an idol in his pocket and was one of only 2 options to go home, and he still doesn't play. I think that's terrible. But for me, actually, JT wasn't that far off from making the list. Like, he was within the top 20, but for me, I just didn't feel like I could credit him enough to put him on there. I considered Tyson, and Tyson, to be honest, before Winners at War, I would have had Tyson in my top 10. I do think Tyson did enough on Blood vs. Water to make me impressed enough to put him, I mean, probably like at the number 8 to 10 source spot, like on the lower end of the list, but I think he definitely would have been on the list. But I do think his run on Winners at War, despite it, like, again, a lot of it being due to the target that he had on his back coming into it, a lot of it having to do with the Poker Alliance and his relationship with Rob and all that sort of stuff. Because of that, I decided to leave Tyson off of this. Again, he's not too far off from making the list, but he didn't show as much game ability on that season as I would have liked him to. And while it was nice to see him play from the bottom for really the first time ever, he wasn't able to scrape himself out of that sort of situation beyond that Amber vote. So I decided to leave him off, but again, he's not too far off from making the actual list. I also considered Russell Hantz because, I mean, it's Russell Hantz. He made it to the end twice. I would at least consider him, but again, just like Amanda and Sandra, it's like just because you make it to the end multiple times doesn't mean that you played the best to get there. And I mean, to be fair, I think Russell played extremely dominantly in Samoa, though he had to use idols to get into that dominant position. In Heroes vs. Villains, he dominated a lot of that game, but I mean, he did it in a way that pissed off the jury. Probably showed more control in that season than Samoa, but pissed off the jury way more, while in Samoa, I think he probably plays a better overall game, but still was able to slate the jury in a way to where they didn't want to vote for him, and that not the way you win Survivor. And I don't feel like he's learned from his ways in the past either. I don't think he's showed that he's changed throughout his run on Redemption Island and Australian Survivor. Like, he's the same player. So for me, I just can't put him on the list. I considered Cochran, and Cochran is tough. I mean, Cochran is someone that I think played one of the most dominant games in Survivor Caramoan and probably had a more impressive win than some of the winners that we'll be talking about that did make the list. However, I just feel like he's such a high variance player. I mean, I think he did very well on Caramoan due to the group he was given. He was given a group that, one, I mean, he knew a lot of them coming into the season, but also just people that would want to keep him around. He had a good reputation at that point. I just don't feel like coming into any random season, he would do nearly as well. I mean, we saw in South Pacific where he became a target due to his like physical weakness and him being kind of out of the main majority socially. And it's like, I just don't feel like he is able to integrate himself within the majority on most seasons. So I left Cochran off. I consider Denise. I think Denise is one of the best social players in Survivor history in terms of just being able to get on the good side of people, but I don't know how well that works without a killer instinct. I feel like that is the thing that Denise is missing. I mean, while she did pull off that Sandra move, and that is impressive, I feel like she's missing a killer instinct in most situations to really pull off a win on her own. So I didn't put Denise on. I considered Malcolm. As again, I think Malcolm played an extremely dominant game in Survivor Philippines, but overall at the end of the day, he didn't win it. I mean, he made a very crucial mistake at the end there that caused him to lose. He played a very sloppy game in Caramoan, and then Game Changers, he wasn't really able to show his full ability. So for me, again, couldn't really put him on the list. Next up, I considered Natalie Anderson. Natalie Anderson was actually on the list initially. When I initially put this list together, she was number 10. And then I did some working around. I actually decided to move one player in particular up, and that caused Natalie to fall off the list. So, I mean, really, you can consider Natalie Anderson number 11. However, after thinking about what happened on Winners at War, to be honest, she might even drop even further because, like, her initial ranking was mostly based off her San Juan del Sur game. But I do think Winners at War, I don't know, I don't love how she played that end game. I mean, I think on her initial season, I think she played San Juan del Sur near flawlessly. Like, outside of being blindsided the Jeremy vote, I think she plays that season perfectly. Like, she, from the final 9 on, she plays a near perfect game. She pulls off moves at the right times in the right ways. And while I do have flaws with the fact that she actively wanted to take Jeremy to the end, it was only due to him being blindsided that she was able to win the game. I do think she plays that endgame very well, but I think she plays the endgame of Winners at War very poorly. I mean, also the fact that she was the first boot. But even when she returns to the game, I feel like she played very passively, which is the complete opposite of what she did the first time. And because of that, that kind of just knocked her off the list for me. I considered Michelle, obviously the only person at this point in Survivor history to make it to the end twice and never be voted out. But the problem is, I think it's a situation like Sandra, where you have to look at how she got there. And I think on her first season, she got extremely lucky with a multitude of things. One, she never went to Tribal until the merge. And she was an initial target on her tribe. They went to that first tribal council. She more than likely gets voted out. She does stay within the majority very early on in that merge in Korong, but then she falls out of the majority and really just scrapes her way to the end through challenge wins and really gets lucky with the Joe medevac, where if she loses that immunity challenge, which more than likely would have been the reward challenge that Aubrey won later on, she gets voted out there. And then even if she doesn't win immunity at Final Four, she gets voted out. So, I mean, I don't look at her first win as very impressive, and then I feel like her Winners at War game is more of that initial game where she's, again, like, just kind of out of the loop for a lot of that post-merge game. Really has no clue what's going on, has to win a couple challenges to get to the end of the game, is very much benefited by the fact that Natalie returns to the game. That benefits her positioning. So, I mean, really, I don't see Michelle as that great of a player at the end of the day, but she was at least in consideration here. I considered Aubrey, but again, Aubrey's another one that I feel like as time's gone on, my opinion of her game has kind of dropped. I mean, I always had faults with her Korong game, even when people were like complaining about how she should have won. And I personally probably would have voted for Aubrey, but again, I still have issues with her game there. Game changers, she was, again, another one that was rarely in the core of the alliance, but was able to survive until deep into the game. And then in Edge of Extinction, she had no clue what was going on. So again, it's kind of a very faulty game, not enough to make it to top 10 for me. I really considered Wendell. As again, Wendell is one of the players that I have the most confidence in coming into any random season, though I feel like there's like a cockiness with Wendell that exudes to other people that I feel like that is something that I don't love about Wendell. I think that's something that could get him targeted most times. And we did see more of that on Winners at War. To be honest, if this was before Winners at War, he probably makes the list. Like, I'm probably on the lower end of things, again, in the 8 to 10 sort of spot, but he probably makes it. But I do think after Winners at War, I mean, he didn't do anything to really, really harm my opinion of him as a player, but I feel like that just like little things kind of knocked him down a bit for me. I obviously consider Dominic, who I personally think played the better game on Ghost Island, as I think it was shown that Dominic was more in control of the game, was the one that was more so moving the pieces on the board, and was also the one that was more willing to flip on Wendell, at least earlier on, than Wendell was able to flip on Dominic. So I do think Dominic played the better game of the two that season, even though Wendell did end up winning just barely. But for me, again, like, I mean, it's very tough to put him on this list. I mean, full disclosure, when we eventually get to the list, it's almost entirely filled with winners, and it would be very tough for a non-winner to make that list. So there's that. And then the last person that was even consideration for me was Nick Wilson. Nick's another one that's like Wendell that I have a lot of confidence in coming into any random season. I think Nick has some issues early on in the game. I think both of his seasons he had some issues early on in the game, but he's able to recover from them. And then if he's able to recover from them, I think he does pretty well most of the time. Nick was another one that like I really did consider, but at the end of the day just didn't make the cut. So there we go. Those are all the honorable mentions. A lot of people there. But now we're on to the actual list, the actual top 10. And as I said, this is a list of almost all winners. Like, it's literally 9 winners and 1 non-winner. So down the road, maybe I will do a non-winning players of all time. So I think that maybe that would be interesting. But let's get started here with number 10. At number 10, I have someone that after Winners at War, I definitely look at them as a better player than what I did beforehand. And that is Sophie Clark. And as I said, like before Winners at War, I don't think Sophie makes the list. I mean, she probably lands somewhere in the top 20, but she definitely doesn't make the top 10. And again, Winners at War did impress me. I think Sophie is someone that has a very good strategic mind for the game of Survivor. I think she has probably one of the best strategic minds for the game of Survivor. I think she's a very good physical player. She obviously won a lot of challenges in her first time around and is very good at puzzles her second time around. She's someone that decent enough socially. I don't think she's the biggest social player in the world. She's not like a social butterfly like some of the people we'll be talking about later, but she is good enough socially to get on the good sides of people. Though I do think that was probably one of the weaker aspects of her original game. But I think on Winners at War, she kind of shown that she was better at getting along with people. And I think she's just a player that has gotten better over time. If we look at her South Pacific game, I mean, I do have issues with, again, like I don't think she was great at building bonds with people outside of her alliance. And even then, I think she came off as a brat at points. However, she was able to keep her core alliance together, her coach and Albert, and they were essentially able to dominate the entire game. She took out Ozzy through her winning that final immunity challenge, and really she ends up winning the game. Though, again, I've always had fault with the fact that she didn't really win the game. It was more so Coach losing the game because the jury was like ready to vote for Coach. Just Coach wasn't doing the right things to get their jury votes, which does make Sophie's win a bit more reliant on the actions of other people more so than the actions of herself, which again is something I do find fault in. But I do think during that season she did demonstrate good ability within the game, and on her second appearance I think she pretty much did everything there but improved upon that. I think I would have a lot of confidence in Sophie coming into any random season from now on. Though I do think her one blind spot was not realizing that Tony had flipped on her, which to be fair, I think is actually probably a bigger knock than what I'm giving it credit for, because really, if you really think about it, considering the position that Sophie was in, where she had a really tight alliance with Sarah and Ben, she was really close with both Kim and Denise, this was the perfect time for Tony to flip on her, and the fact that she didn't realize that is probably a knock against her. But I do feel more confident in her overall game ability now than I did before Winners at War, so she lands here at number 10. So number 9, and number 9 was tough, because the thing is, these two people that I'm about to be talking about at number 8 and number 9 here weren't originally on my list. And these two are the only one-time players on this list, and it was really tough between the two. One, on whether or not their one-time playing the game was enough to warrant a place in the top 10 players of all time, but also which one was better between the two. And this was super, super close. And obviously I'll talk about this probably more when I eventually do a top 10 one-time player list, which I do plan on doing in the future. But at number 9 here, I have Earl Cole. And Earl was tough because like the thing is that like when I'm comparing Earl to someone like a Tom or a Yul, I feel like they're very, very close. I feel like the main difference here for Earl is just how naturally gifted he is at the game. I mean, we saw him come into Fiji not knowing anything about Survivor, never having watched the show, literally being a last-minute cast there. Like, he literally had no time to research the show or anything. And he completely dominates the game from beginning to end with ease. Like, he never really has any trouble and is never shown really being on the bottom, even at the point of the swap, where he's swapped into a position where his tribe technically is lower in the numbers, but he just easily is able to get back into the numbers, getting like Boo and Stacy to flip. He's never really in danger earlier on in the game. The only vote he gets the entire season is a vote from Rita, which was just a throwaway vote. In the post-merge, he's looked at as the leader of that majority alliance. And while he's not the one creating the plans left and right, like he is still the figurehead of that alliance and is still able to run his way all the way to the end. And somehow even at the final 4, when Dreams has immunity and he's supposed to give it up to Yam and all this sort of stuff is happening, when like really he's one of the few options to be voted out, he's still not being targeted. And everyone wanted to take him to the final 3. Like that's so impressive in my eyes, just how naturally gifted he is at the game of Survivor, and he wins unanimously. Mind you, against Dreams and Cassandra, two of the bigger goats in the history of Survivor, but it's still a very, very impressive win. And I just feel like we see less faults in his game than Tom or Yul, who could have potentially also made this list. Like, I really have almost no downsides for Earl as a player. And really the only reason he's not above the next person we'll be talking about is because the next person that we will be talking about played more recently and has shown that he can also play from the bottom, play from the top. He's a more adaptable player from what we've seen. But I wouldn't be surprised if Earl really does have the ability to be a much better player than some of the other players that we'll be talking about later. It's just that we haven't seen that So based off of what we've seen, I felt like number 9 was a good position for him. Now number 8, as I said, the other one-time player on the list. And again, this is going to spoil my one-time player ranking eventually down the road, but oh well. At number 8, we have Tommy Sheehan. And this is stuff, again, like him and Earl are super close. Like it's really, really close between the two. And the thing that gave me a bump on Tommy was the fact that Tommy was thrown into some really bad scenarios, not by his doing, but mostly due to like random swaps or whatnot, and was able to still make it out of those and make it back to the position to where he was dominating the game. He starts off the game very well positioned. He's in the middle of the tribe without being targeted. After the swap is a point where he should have been in danger. At the point where they come into that swap tied in numbers, Tommy's group is able to pull in Aaron and Missy to the point where if Elaine didn't get that advantage, they win out on that vote. And I think that's a very impressive move. Obviously, they do end up down in numbers due to Elaine getting the block a vote, and through that, Tommy does become in danger, but he's able to scrape through to the merge, where from that point on, again, he's able to dominate the entire way through with the exception of one round, which is the round where the tribes are split into 2. And again, he gets a very unfortunate swap where he's swapped with 4 other Lyro members. He's the only original Vokai. But even in that scenario, he's somehow able to scrape his way through, where he gets Elaine and Karishma to flip against Missy. And again, very impressive that he was able to survive that. And then from the rest of the game on, he straight up dominates the game. He has so many great relationships with Janet and Lauren and Dean. The Dean one actively saves him at the final 8 round. At the very end of the game, he's able to convince Nora not to put him into the fire-making challenge, which is so impressive. I mean, Tommy just played a straight-up dominant game the entire way through. One of the most impressive winners, in my opinion, in the history of Survivor. And he's shown that he can play the modern game of Survivor while also being able to recover from bad positions that he didn't actively put himself into. So for me, Tommy lands here at number 8. Now number 7, and this is where it gets tough, because for me, this top 7 was pretty solid. Like, I knew who the top 7 were going to be. The order obviously switched around as time went on, but I was pretty solid at who was going to be here. And at number 7 here, I believe we actually have the earliest player out of the entire bunch here, and that is Boston Rob. Boston Rob's a tough player to rank because it's either he straight up dominates a season and gets to the end and, in my opinion, wins more times than he loses, or he's taken out in the pre-merge or probably even early merge for being a dominant force in the game. And that's a tough game to rank. I do feel like there's a lot of people that do discredit his game, that try to say that the only reason he won Redemption Island is because it was a bunch of idiots, and try to talk about like how obviously it took him 4 times to win. That's not really a factor for me. And again, like I don't feel like it was simply just because Redemption Island's cast was so bad, because we've seen him literally every single season play the exact same way and still have some level of success doing that. Obviously, his first time, he completely controlled his tribe, was able to make every decision for it, and obviously that led him to be down in the numbers, but he was still able to take control of his initial group. All-Stars, obviously, he dominated from beginning to end. Heroes vs. Villains, he completely dominated his tribe to the point where obviously he built up a bad relationship with Russell. And at the point that Russell was able to flip the numbers, I mean, Rob was a goner. Redemption Island, again, dominated from beginning to end. And even on Winners at War, while he was on the bottom, we did see him initially be able to be a central figure within that game. And I think Rob has also one of the best strategic minds for the game. I think he's someone that you can always bank on knowing what his optimal move is and executing that optimal move, especially modern Boston Rob. I think maybe Boston Rob from All-Stars maybe had a bit of faulty logic, but I do think Redemption Island, Boston Rob, and onwards, I do think that Boston Rob is one of the best players we've ever seen in terms of the strategic game. He's obviously really good at challenges, has won, I believe, the record amount of challenges in the history of Survivor, right, across the entire career. I just don't feel like you can consider Boston Rob a bad player of Survivor. I do think his game is much more high variance than some of the other players we'll be talking about. And that's why he is as low as number 7 here. But he does have a very strong mind for the game and is able to execute a good chunk of times. I think he probably wins more than most people give him credit for. I think his strategy works on more casts than people give him credit for. Mind you, I do think it's less likely that it works on a more modern cast than it does on a cast from the past, but I still think he just naturally has a knack for this game. And so for me, Boston Rob lands here at number 7. Now, number 6, we have another play that was tough. I think him and Rob are very, very close. I actually went back and forth between the two for a while. But at number 6 here, I have Jeremy. And the reason I went with Jeremy here above Boston Rob is because I think Jeremy is someone that's naturally gifted at Survivor to the point where I do feel like he's always going to get to the merge. And I feel like there is at least a chance that Jeremy can go a little bit under the radar. I feel like with Boston Rob, he's always going to be out in front. He's always going to be a target coming to the merge. It's just a matter of whether or not he has enough people around him to support him. Well, I feel like Jeremy, there's at least a chance he can be overshadowed by some other figures. Obviously in Cambodia, we saw this with him being overshadowed by the Joe and Savages of the world. He was able to use his meat shield strategy very well on that season. And really, his gameplay on Cambodia is the main reason why he is on this list, because I do think his gameplay in Cambodia is very strong and very repeatable. Now, we did see him try to execute that again on Winners at War, and it didn't work out nearly as well, but I feel like that was because the level of competition on that season was obviously much higher than normal. I also feel like he was harmed by outside relationships and was never really able to get his footing in the game on that season. But if we go back to like San Juan del Sur, I think he played very impressively on that season as well. While I do think he gets pretty lucky that Julie ends up leaving the game, that causes John Mish to hold off on targeting him for a round, I do think Jeremy showed a lot of skill on that season, with him obviously dominating his initial tribe. I think San Juan del Sur was a good lesson for him as well, as that's where he learned that being out in front isn't a viable strategy. As I do think he was pretty much a goner by the time of his boot on that season. Like, even if he makes it through that round, he just simply doesn't have the numbers to make it all the way to the end, which is what caused his evolution of his strategy in Cambodia. I think he's a player that's willing to adapt his game to what works. Like, he realizes what he does wrong and is able to adapt afterwards, which is a very important quality, in my opinion, for a Survivor player. And I just feel like Jeremy is one of the most consistent players in the history of the game. I think he's someone that is always going to get to the merge. It's just a matter of how he gets there. Again, like, he just didn't come into a good position in San Juan del Sur, where he was too blatantly the leader of Alliance. I think in Winners at War, he came off on the opposite end of things, where he didn't have any power really at all, despite being in the initial majority. And by the time things played out, he just didn't have any control towards the end game and really couldn't do much from that point forward. While, again, I think in Cambodia, he had the right mixture of things. He had the right number of meat shields, he had the right number of threats outside of his alliance that allowed him to propel himself towards the end of that game. So again, Jeremy's someone that's always going to do well at the game. It's just a matter of how his positioning is later on in the game, and if he's able to execute that, I think he wins more times than not. So because I considered him more of a consistent player than Boston Rob, so he lands here at number 6. Now at number 5, here, we have the only non-winning player on the list. And at number 5, we have Cirie. I don't think you can do a top 10 list of Survivor players without Cirie. I think Cirie has to be the best non-winning player in the history of Survivor, which again is probably a spoiler for whenever I do my non-winning top 10 players of all time, but whatever. The fact that Cirie still hasn't won Survivor is really a tragedy if we think about it. I mean, obviously, I think everyone knows Cirie's history, but let's just go through it. Obviously, in Panama, she has a very rocky start, but is able to get herself out of really tricky situations. And by the time of the merge, her alliance completely dominates, and she's able to take control of it at the final 6, where she blindsides Courtney. And through her alliance with Aras, she was very well positioned to get towards the end of the game. It's really largely due to Terry Dietz having the God Idol that she is poorly positioned at the Final 4, where she has to go to fire making against Danielle and loses there. And to be fair, I mean, we've learned it from Exit Press and stuff that she more than likely doesn't win that season if she gets to the end against Aras or Terry. But I do think Cirie was obviously a very good player on that season either way. On Micronesia is obviously probably the biggest tragedy of all, where she probably wins in the scenario that was supposed to happen. I mean, she got to the final 3 with her, Amanda, and Parvati on a season that everyone thought was going to have a final 3 and really was supposed to have a final 3 up until the point where James got medevaced. And to be fair, I mean, in that scenario, it is very, very close. It is a 3-2 vote, with Alexis essentially being the deciding vote there. And who really knows where it goes, though, based on Ponderosa videos and post-game interviews, does lean towards Cirie, but again, it is very close. But I do think Cirie probably wins that final 3 scenario. But with the last second change to it being a final 2, that really screws her over. Mind you, I do consider that kind of a fault that you were the third in a 3-person alliance. That made it so that if like Natalie had won final immunity at the final 4, then more than likely Cirie goes home there. So I do consider that actually a minor fault anyway, but it's like, it's not really a big one to the point where it really detracts from her game. And again, in the scenario that was supposed to happen, she should have won. And then here's her villain. She gets taken out early due to being a big threat and due to, well, essentially Stephen Fishbach telling JT right before he goes out there that, hey, if you have the chance to get out Cirie, get her out. And that's the main reason she goes home there. And despite her now having this massive target on her back, coming into Game Changers, she's still able to get to the end of the game and really loses largely due to Advantage Geddon. I mean, at that point in the game, like if she gets to the end, she wins the game against anybody. It's just a matter of getting there. And the fact that Advantage Geddon happened, let's just say no one has any idols or immunities or whatever or during that round. I mean, Sarah goes home at the final 6, and her, Ty, and Aubrey are able to run the table. They get to the final 3. Cirie wins that. I think they possibly could turn on her at 4. But then again, if Brad Culpepper wins out, because that becomes even a worse scenario for Cirie. But either way, I mean, like, she becomes obviously decently positioned if she makes it through that round. Who knows what really happens? But she does obviously get taken out just due to everyone else having an advantage. But overall, she is just such a good social player. She's very good at building bonds with people, and she's such a great strategic player as well. Very good at knowing what her optimal move is. Now, I do think she gets a bit too much credit at points, but she's still a massive strategic player. And really, the main reason she's this low on the list, though, is because I do think just inherently she does have some trouble getting through those first initial rounds. I don't think she's the biggest physical player in the game. And, like, I mean, she was a target early on in Game Changers. She goes to one of those first few tribals. She's one of the first boots. She was obviously in danger in the original season of Panama. So, I mean, I do think there's danger earlier on in the game for her. And that's the reason why she is lower on the list. I mean, that and also the fact that she hasn't won yet, but it's like, Cirie's still obviously a great player, so it's enough for her to rank here at number 5. Now at number 4, and this was tough. For me, this is the definitive top 4 players of Survivor up to this point. It's really a matter of the ordering here, and I don't feel like people are going to agree with my ordering here, especially with who I put at number 4, because I think this is someone that a lot of people have at number 1. But I had this person at number 1 when I first made this list. But then, like, I just kept on thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it. It's just like she just slowly dropped every single time I revisited my list here. And she ends up at number 4, and that is Parvati. Now, for the longest time, I always thought of Parvati as the best player ever. I always thought of her as the best player of all time. She was, at one point, my favorite player of all time. However, I think when you really analyze her game, you realize just how many holes there are in both her Micronesia and Heroes vs. Villains games. I was in Cook Island, she didn't really know what she was doing, and even then she did pretty well, actually. She was pretty well positioned to actually win that game if she was able to get to the end with her alliance. But I don't think she played nearly as hard as what she would do in future games. In Micronesia, she obviously won that season, but then again, she was going to the end. She wanted to go to the final 3 with her, Cirie, and Amanda in a situation where Cirie probably wins that final 3. Now, there are, again, question marks that maybe Parvati could win that, but really, it's not a great scenario to be going against Cirie at the very end of the game. And I feel like Heroes vs. Villains is a game that she gets way too much credit for. I feel like in Heroes vs. Villains, she plays a very sloppy game. Obviously, she was a massive target right from the beginning and largely gets saved due to the fact that Russell was able to play an idol on her at the Tyson boot. And they really just luck their way into Tyson throwing his vote away on Parvati, which causes him to be voted out. And then after that, they take control by voting out Boston Rob, which again, like, I feel like that was more so Russell than it was actual Parvati. She also gets credit for the double idol play, which is a solid move. I mean, again, I think her ability to read people is very strong. And I think that is a great move to use the 2 idols there, though. I mean, to be honest, in my opinion, it would have been better if she was able to get away with that using only 1 idol, but whatever. I think one of the biggest faults of her game on that season is her jury management. She really just doesn't manage the heroes well. I mean, I think one, she too closely aligns herself with Russell to the point where everyone looks at her as like Russell's follower, especially after that Danielle boot where Russell boots Danielle to get closer to Parvati. That's not great. But then also, we learned after the season that she just simply didn't treat the heroes well. I mean, she would like openly mock them by like reading JT's letter out loud, and like she would just not do proper jury management with them. And then also the fact that, I mean, to be fair, there were people on there that just inherently weren't going to vote for her. Amanda and Candace were people that were just had a vendetta against her anyway. But even then, she has to win out by winning the final 5 and final 6 challenges. If she doesn't win those, she more likely goes home there. Like, I really just don't look at her Heroes vs. Villain game as that impressive in the grand scheme of Survivor. I mean, like, I think while she is adaptable, she's able to maneuver her way through that game. There were a lot of lucky circumstances that helped her out there. And then also at the end, like, she actively manages the jury poorly. Now, obviously, she doesn't do that well on Winners at War, but I was actually impressed with her ability on that season. I do think she does a pretty good job based on the circumstances she was in. Obviously, she was never going to do well in that season. She had too big of a target coming into that season, but I do think she actually was able to read people pretty well. I think she aligned herself with the right people that were able to get her further, but I mean, at the end of the day, she was never doing that well in that season. I do think Parvati gets too much credit as being a consistent player of Survivor. I hear a lot of people say that, oh, like 100 games of Survivor, I would have so much confidence in Parvati. And it's like, when you really look at the evidence, it's like, why? Why do you have that confidence? Because if we look at literally every single season she's been in, she's been targeted right from the beginning. With the exception of Cook Islands, which was obviously a completely different Parvati. But even in Micronesia, we had the Penners of the world like targeting her right off the bat. And there's a very good chance that she's actually the first boot on that season if Johnny Fairplay doesn't quit the game. Both in Heroes vs. Villains and Winners at War, she has a target right on her back right away. So for me, again, I do love Parvati as a player, but I just feel like there's so many faults in her game to where she has to land here at number 4. Now at number 3, and number 3 was someone that really took a big jump up after Winners at War. This was someone that was probably still in the top 10, but again, was probably like around the 6 or 7 sort of mark, but now at number 3, I have Sarah Lacina. Again, Sarah really impressed me on Winners at War. I mean, I always looked at her as a very strong player. I think in Cagayan, if she didn't go on that power trip she did at the merge, I think she had a very good chance of getting really far in that game, possibly winning the game. I mean, based on her positioning on the original Braun tribe, she was in a very strong position being in the middle of things there, and she was able to build really strong bonds on her swap tribe that saved her there. But on Game Changers, she was just on another level. I mean, the way that she made really strong social bonds and then used those bonds to benefit her game, made a lot of strategic moves like blindsiding Sierra Dawn Thomas to get the legacy advantage, blindsiding people left and right like Debbie and Andrea and Michaela, and like those moves were impressive, though again, and we saw that at the end of the game that caused a lot of bitterness towards her. And while she was still able to get their jury votes at the end, I don't know if that necessarily worked on every season. And that's why coming into Winners at War, I was a bit kind of on her, especially with how cocky she was acting preseason. And she had a really massive target on her back coming into that. But the fact that she was able to avoid all of that and get all the way to the final 4 in a season where she was able to have, again, another season where she has some of the strongest bonds we've ever seen. She closely was aligned. Tony, Ben, Sophie, had relationships with Kim and Denise. She was really the main figure within that majority alliance coming into the merge. She was kind of the glue that pieced everyone together. And I feel like that's such an impressive position for her to be in, considering, again, she came in with such a massive target on her back. Like, Winners at War really cemented her as one of the best social players in the history of Survivor. However, I do think it also caused a bigger knock on her game for me in terms of her strategic game. I do think she just misses something strategically. While she is very cutthroat, I don't love that she wasn't willing to split the votes at the final 6. I think that was terrible. I think her voting out Ben at the final 5 also ruined her chances of winning the game. And I also don't love how she was willing to take Tony to the end. I do think she has faults in her game, but then again, I think some of those had to do with the fact that she had outside relationships that did influence some of those decisions, and also like information from the Edge influenced some of those decisions. So I think there's some sort of leniency I'm going to give to those things, but I do feel like Sarah Lacina is a masterful player of Survivor. I think she's one of the most consistent players of Survivor we've ever seen. Again, she's never been taken out before a merge. I mean, she's never ever actually been targeted even before the merge outside of that Boston Rob vote, and that's even barely anything. And while I do think she still has the potential to pull off a President Sarah sort of moment, even in a modern season, I do think on most seasons of the game, she is able to make a pretty deep run. Then I think she's also susceptible to a bitter jury, so that's not particularly great, but I think overall she is one of the best players we've ever seen. She lands here at number 3. Now at number 2, and number 2 here was pretty tough actually, because this one was actually at number 4, I think, when I initially made this list. I just decided to bump her up more and more when I thought about it. And at number 2 here, we have Kim Spradlin. And here's the thing. Obviously, after One World, she was looked at as one of the best players of all time. But a lot of people said, oh, she only played one time, so we need to wait until another time to really rank her in the all-time greats. But I mean, if we look at that one time she played in One World, that's the most dominant game in the history of Survivor, 100%. She had control, very clear control from the beginning till the end. Never had a point where she was targeted by anyone outside of Troyzan. And she was able to dominate the game without creating any animosity towards her, again, outside of Troyzan. She's one of the few people to have dominated the game to the point where the jury is happily willing to give the money to her. I think that's one of the biggest boons for her game for me, is not even just the complete control, but also the masterful jury management as well. But then we come into Winners at War, and she gets off to a rocky start. I mean, there's that. But I will say, after Winners at War, I feel like I think of her as the exact same player as I did even after One World. I mean, obviously, everyone has their faults. I mean, these people are humans. Like, they're not perfect beings. But I feel like with Winners at War, I think Kim showed me exactly what I needed to see to really think of her as one of the all-time greats. And I think a lot of this comes from the fact that despite her starting off on the bottom, she was never even targeted within that group. I mean, we see that the Game Changers group actually thought about bringing Kim in. We also saw the single players group that Yul created that wanted to bring Kim in. So she was never really a massive target despite her starting off on the bottom. Coming to the swap, she was able to regroup and build a really strong bond with Jeremy and became the center of the tribe at that point. Coming to the merge, she was a big decision maker within that majority alliance. And I do think she makes a fall again. Like, I think her getting rid of Adam was probably the biggest knock against her game, considering Adam would have given her the numbers, and getting rid of him pretty much doomed her unless she played her idol correctly, which she ends up not doing. But even through that, she was able to recover for her next few rounds, where she was able to get back within the majority, even though she does eventually get blindsided when she starts targeting Tony at the final 8. But again, I think Kim played as well as she could have on that season outside of that Adam move. Again, I think she displayed how good she is socially. She was still really great at building social bonds. I still think strategically she has a very good mind for the game. Physically, she's still good at challenges. She's still the great all-around player that she was the first time around. And for me, I mean, I just felt like Winners at War just cemented my opinion of her game more than anything, and she's still one of the all-time greats, so for me, she lands here at number 2. Now at number 1, the number 1 player of all time for me, I can't believe I'm saying this, Tony Vlachos. And again, as I said, like, when I initially made this list, I didn't have Tony as number 1. And a lot of that's because I still think Tony is Tony. I mean, Tony played in Cagayan, played a very haptic game, came back in Game Changers trying to replicate that. Obviously didn't work. And then he adapted for Winners at War and did very well there. But I was just a bit unsure of whether he would be able to do that for any given season. And because of that, I didn't really want to put Tony at number 1. But then I just thought about his game in Winners at War more and more and more. And I just feel like I have to put him at number 1. Not because he's the 2-time winner of Survivor or anything like that, but more so just the way he played the game, the way that he was able to adapt and learn from his previous game, the flexibility that he showed within that game, the good reads that he displayed throughout that game. I just feel like Tony is the epitome of Survivor. I think he's everything that you would want in a Survivor player. Obviously, he showed that he can do physical challenges. He's very good socially, despite him coming off as a goof at some points. He is still good socially. He does make good bonds with people. And then strategically, I mean, he is probably one of the people that I have the most confidence in making the optimal strategic move for his game. I think he's someone that understands timing, the right time to make moves, as shown in Cagayan, where he flips at 9, 7, and 5. As shown in Winners at War, where he makes that massive Sophie move at the final 9, pretty much at the last chance that he would have the numbers to do it. I do think Tony is, again, a masterful player of Survivor, and I really didn't think I would be saying this until after Winners at War. Again, before Winners at War, he's not in the top 10. He's just straight up not. I think before Winners at War, I really considered him a one-hit wonder, like someone that would only do what he did in Cagayan one time, because that Cagayan game, while extremely dominant, is a game that is very high variance. I don't think it works with every single cast. I think it only worked that one season. We saw that with Game Changers where he's booed right away, and I think after that it really just cemented it for me that he wasn't as good of a player as he was a winner. However, his return on Winners at War really just showed how great of a player he was. The fact that he was able to adapt and play a more low-key game for the first half of that season and then turn it up to his normal Cagayan self while still having extremely strong social bonds to make it so people didn't want to flip on him. It's like a lot of people say, oh, like the first time, it's like he had Trish that was willing to fix all of his mistakes, and they consider that a knock against him. But it's like on Winners at War, he didn't even have that and was still able to make it through just solely on his social bonds. And I think that is something that you gotta be impressed by. He's also one of the winners that's faced the most adversity out of the entire batch. Tony at the final 3 of Cagayan should have already won that game, but then they announced the twist that, oh, we're gonna have a final 2, and that should have been the death of Tony there, especially when Wu wins final immunity. But Tony's able to convince Wu to take him to the end, that his preaching about honor and loyalty wouldn't mean anything if he didn't take Tony to the end. Again, that's so impressive on Tony's part that he was able to make Wu make a $1 million mistake, a mistake that literally cost him the game. And at Winners at War, I mean, the Edge returnee really ruins his game. Natalie returning to the game really ruins his positioning, but he's still able to make it to the end. Despite her returning and playing 2 idols in a row and then winning final immunity, he's still able to make it to the end and still crush her in the jury votes. I mean, Tony played 2 of the most dominant games in the history of Survivor, and in his Winners at War game, I think one of the least flawed winning games in the history of Survivor. And for me, that's completely different than like Sandra, who despite having won twice, I think played 2 of the worst winning games in the history of Survivor. But also mixing that in with, again, I think Tony understands the game. He understands the strategy of the game. He's very good at social bonds. He's decent enough physically. Again, like I just think Tony is the perfect player for Survivor at this current point. So for me, he lands at number 1. So there we go. Those are my top 10 players of all time for Survivor US. Now, I would like to do some more top 10 videos. I would like to do a non-winning top 10 player ranking in the future. I would like to do a one-time player ranking in the future. So those will be coming up. Obviously, along with that, more typical sort of Survivor videos like casting videos, and hopefully I get around to eventually doing the global Survivor winner ranking and season ranking. I don't know when that's going to be, but it'll be at some point. But for now, that's the video. That's my top 10 players for Survivor US. Thank you for watching.